In this video, you will find my recipe for the homemade finish, how to store the finish, is this finish food safe, and how to prepare the bowl for the finish. In addition, I'll cover the process in applying the finish, as well as how to touch up old bowls, and answer the question, why would you want to use this finish? I'll also go into more detail on the system of buffing the bowls and the tools used, and end the video with the discussion on homemade versus store-bought. Hello, I'm Dennis Pervinsky, and welcome to Grandpa Dennis's Wood Turning Studio. Today, the video is all about finishing, the finish I use on all of my wood turnings, and any other wood projects that I do. You would think that this is pretty simple and a straightforward process. However, once you start getting into the details, it's quite complex. So I'm going to go over all of the steps, what I use, how I use it, and the maintenance part. To start off, the finish I use is a homemade concoction. However, I didn't invent it. This was made by a gentleman named Sam Maloof, a famous furniture maker from California. He was the first one to use this process, and very successfully. In a nutshell, it's 1/3 pure tung oil, 1/3 polyurethane, and 1/3 boiled linseed oil. I mix those products together, put them into a large pail, mix it fairly well but not aggressively. Then I pour it into these stop-loss bags. They're available from a lot of woodworking stores. The reason I put them in here, as you can see, I've already used part of this particular bag, but there's very little air up in the top part. The air is what's going to cause you problems. When you put the oil into a container like this as an example, and it's only partly filled, the air in there starts to cure the finish, and you get this coating of hardened finish on the top. So you really do lose a lot of your finish in the end. With this process, you can squeeze the bag and you'll be squeezing the air out, and then you cap it at the top. In that way, very little air gets in, and I end up using virtually the entire bag with very little waste in it. A lot of people are concerned about the question, is the finish food safe? And from all the research I've been able to do, my answer is yes. It becomes food safe over a short period of time. The issue that causes concern for people is the solvents that are in the Varathane and the dryers that are in the Varathane and the boiled linseed oil. Once the product cures, those two issues dissipate. The solvent and the dryers evaporate and dissipate from the finish, leaving just the natural products that are in all of the ingredients. So yes, it does become food safe. I do have this small bowl that I never finished and basically abandoned. I was not thrilled with the cracks in here, although I could fill that. But I'm going to use this to demonstrate the final sanding that I'll do, and then the finish and how I put it on, and describe some of the issues as I'm doing that. So, let's get on to the lathe, and I'll show you how the process works. Step to a good finish is a good sanding. Now I've got this fairly well done, but I'm going to just go over it a little bit more. I'm going to start at 220 grit here. Now, one thing I want to explain is the speed of sand of the piece should be pretty close to the speed of your drill. So that's kind of hard to gauge, but I tend to go on the slower side of the piece. Now I'm at 360 right here, and that feels very, very smooth. Normally, on a piece of wood, I wouldn't go much more than 360, 400 grit. However, I do a lot of resin casting, and I have to go up to about 1500 for that. Once I get to 220, I blow the dust off the piece, because I think the next grits up, you want them to sand the wood, not the dust. So between those higher grits, I tend to blow the dust off each time. I'm at 600 here. I can hardly feel the difference between 600 and 400. However, on resin, the scratches remain, and you've got to go all the way up to the 1500 to get rid of those. The next process I use is a buffing wheel. I use the white diamond compound. It's a grit that's approximately 15 to 16, 1700 grit, and it's embedded in wax. So I've got a buffing wheel attached to my drill. So it brings out a shine already. However, because the grit is embedded in wax, I have to remove the wax part because it may interfere with the finish. Doing this also gives you an opportunity to see the color of the wood. Now for the first coat of finish. I use these paper cups to pour a little bit of finish in there. And then squeeze the air out of the stop-loss bag and put the cap back on. I use rolls of industrial toilet paper, and that's what I use to put the finish onto the piece. However, a lot of people swear by needing lint-free rags to saturate the piece. It's also a good idea to use disposable gloves so you don't get finish onto your hands and have to use a solvent to get it off. So I saturate the tissue and put it on. So, a decision has to be made before you put that on. Do you want to add any solvent to the finish? A rule of thumb that I follow generally is to put about 10% of solvent in the finish for the first coat and maybe even the second coat, depending on the wood. Now, what does that do? Well, the solvent thins out the recipe, and it allows it to soak into the wood more. If you have a wood that's fine-grained and very dense, you'd want to do this. This particular piece is scrub oak. It is very hard, but the grain is rather coarse, so it may not really need the solvent for it to help penetrate. But that's an option you have. Use that when you think you need more penetration in the wood. And I'm talking about 10%. In this much finish, that's not a lot. So, choices to be made right off the bat. Do you want to use tissue or do you want to use a cloth? The tissue I've got is very inexpensive and I use it for a lot of things around the shop. A cloth works well too. Sometimes the tissue has a tendency on breaking off little pieces and sticking on the finish. The next step decision you want to make is, are you going to put some solvent in here to help it penetrate more? So, here we are. We've got this finish on. Take a look at the piece. See if there's any parts in here where the finish has soaked in already, and add some more. One of the benefits of this type of finish is it tends to hide the scratches a little bit. So if you have minute scratches that only show up under certain light conditions, this oil type finish tends to cover them. Now, the trick is to leave this for about 5 to 10 minutes, let it soak in, and just let it get, it's not going to be curing, but it'll be soaking in a lot. Don't be afraid to have a lot of finish on there with a lot of spillover and an excess of finish. Now, after about 10 minutes, this is a little bit tacky. Not much, just a slight bit. So, the next process is to wipe off as much as you possibly can. In this case, I'm using a cloth because it doesn't leave any paper residue that you would get from tissue paper. Now you noticed I wiped it off with the lathe not running, then I ran the lathe to wipe more off. The reason I did the initial wipe off was to get the excess off so it doesn't go flying all over when the lathe is running. Now I want the lathe to run and I want to hold the cloth against the wood. The purpose of that is to add a little bit of friction. and that friction creates a little bit of heat, and it helps the whole finish set up and cure better. So I'm applying a fair amount of pressure on there, but again, that depends on the piece you're doing. If it's very thin, you may not want to put that much pressure on it. Or if you're not holding it very secure to the lathe. So the shininess is pretty much gone from that piece because we've wiped off so much of the finish. This is counterintuitive. Why would you wipe finish off when you want to build coats onto the surface of the wood? I don't know the answer to that, but Sam Maloof used to take, instead of a cloth like this, he would take burlap and he would rub and rub and rub until he got everything off. Now comes time for curing. This piece should be left for an overnight for 24 hours to set up and cure more. After the 24 hours, put it back on the lathe if possible and feel whether or not it's raised the grain or maybe some dust from the location you had it sitting in is on there. That's when you need to do another coat of buffing or sanding. And in this case, it might be just a touch that's needed. So I would go to a 600 or an 800 grit. And I would do a real fast sanding. That's enough. Then I would use the alcohol to wipe off the dust from that last Now I'm ready for the second coat. Now on the second coat, I would just use a dampened cloth or dampened tissue, not a lot of finish. Just a slightly dampened to put a little bit on. Wait 5 to 10 minutes. Let it set up a little bit. Then wipe it off again. Remember, this is 24 hours later. Again, let it set for 24 hours. Come back, and if you've taken off a lot of the finish in the wiping process, after 24 hours, this is going to be very smooth. But if there's a little bit of roughness to it, again, do the final sanding at the super high grit. Get the dust off of that, and again, put on another coat of finish. I usually do this 3 or 4 times, and it just starts to pop. So after the 4th coat of finish on this, it keeps that shiny kind of effect. I use the high gloss polyurethane or high gloss Varathane. However, if you don't like the super shininess, you can get a satin or a lower gloss, and you will get a slightly duller finish. Now, Sam Maloof had come up with a second stage to this. He did a second mixture. His mixture was boiled linseed oil, pure tung oil, and beeswax. He melted the beeswax and combined it into the other 2 ingredients, all on an equal basis. 1/3 beeswax, 1/3 boiled linseed oil, and 1/3 pure tung oil. He put that finish on for 2 or 3 coats once this initial coat was cured. I've never done that. I've always stopped at the initial recipe and never went any further. And that seemed to be okay for me. After the finish is completely cured, it is food safe. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a piece I did that needs another coat on it. It's been sitting for several days in our home. I've attached a vacuum chuck to my lathe because I don't have any way of gripping the bottom of this. Now this piece is being held on with vacuum that's near the maximum that my pump can produce. If you knock it, it'll break the seal and come off. I don't have it perfectly centered, but then I'm not looking at doing a lot of pressure on here or a lot of cutting. There is resin in there, so this piece needs to be handled with a higher grit. It's relatively smooth, but there are some parts in here that are just a little bit coarse. So I've got an 800 grit. I'm going to feel where those parts are. I'll clean it with the alcohol. And that gets rid of whatever dust particles were there. Then do some buffing. Then another cleaning with the alcohol to get rid of any wax that might be left on here. This is how much finish I'm now going to put on. Just a very little bit to make it look wet. After a few minutes, I'm back again to do the final rub out. Now this piece has had about 4 or 5 coats on it already. You notice when I did the oak bowl, when I put the finish on, it looked nice and shiny, and then when I rubbed it off, it ended up looking dull. Well, that's the process. That always happens. But since this is the 4th or 5th coat on this particular piece, when I rubbed off that thin coat that I just put on, it sparkles. It's now bright and shiny as a gloss finish. If I did another coat, it would be even shinier. So the more coats you put on, the more it builds up a finish. Another question is, I have not done the bottom. That's going to come at a later date. But on the bottom, I'm going to be doing that off of the lathe and just finishing the bottom. So I find that the finish ends up being much better if you do it when the bowl is turning on the lathe. Now, I have done this process without the lathe, and I've done it by just soaking this by hand and then rubbing it all off by hand, doing the sides and the interior. However, I always leave the bottom to the end because I put this in my home to dry and cure. When it's completely cured and I'm finished the process, I will then do the bottom, and then I would let it sit this way in my home to cure the bottom. Here's a piece that I did about 15 years ago. The finish still is quite nice on it. It's the same process I used on this one. Now I'm going to do another coat on this. I don't think it really needs it, but I'll just show you what to do after many years. So again, the vacuum chuck holds it on. I'm not worried about it being centered exactly because I'm doing less strenuous work on the piece. Again, this has gone up to 27 inches. I think 28 is the maximum for my altitude here in Canada. Now, because this piece is uneven on the rim, I'm going to do sanding by hand, and I'll start at 800. Because the piece has an awkward lip on here, and I don't want the lathe running and catching on these protrusions, that'll rip it off of the vacuum chuck. So I'll do this with the lathe turned off. Now that feels like glass. Again, the alcohol here to get rid of any dust particles that are left from that sanding. And I think that's one of the secrets. This is one of the secrets in having a finish that's nice and smooth for the second, third, or fourth coat. Again, it's just a dampened cloth. After a couple of minutes, it's a wipe down. Now that piece is brought back to life. Here's the bottom, how it was after 10 or 15 years, and now it's sparkling again. A question you might be asking is, this seems like a lot of trouble to go through to put a finish on. Well, it is a lot of work, it's time consuming, but I think it really pays off. There's no drips or runs with this type of finish. It's easy to apply. You just put it on and rub it off. And the big thing for me is it leaves a natural looking finish. Most oil finishes are like that. It's really nice and smooth. It doesn't look like plastic. Even if it's high gloss, it looks like an oiled finish and the natural beauty of the wood comes out. That's the part I like the most. Now the question comes, what if I don't have a vacuum chuck to hold my piece on the lathe? Well, as I explained, you can do all the processes without it being on the lathe. It's just a little bit more work. It's a little harder rubbing that's needed, and the finish, it'll come out the same after 3 or 4 coats, but it's a lot easier for me to do it on the lathe. The buffing process is another question you might have. This apparatus is from the Beal Company. It's a Morris 2 taper that goes through your lathe, and it's bolted on at the other end to keep this from spinning off the lathe. And this buffing wheel gets charged with the buffing compound. You can also get different sizes and different shapes of buffing wheels. If you want to do the interior of a bowl, this might be a better shape. So you could put this onto your lathe and then take the bowl and push the bowl against the buffing wheel, instead of what I was doing, running it on the lathe and pushing the wheel against the wood. I want to add a section in here on the buffing wheels. This is the setup that I showed you a little bit earlier, and it's from the Beal system. The number 2 taper goes in and it's tightened at this end so that it doesn't slip out. These are the buffing wheels from Beal, and I've marked on here white. I've got one here that's marked Triple E. I have a third one that's wax. This is the compound that's got the Triple E in it. It's a abrasive that's in a wax block. This is called White Diamond. It's got an abrasive in the wax block as well. Now, this one, to the best of my knowledge, comes out to be anywhere from 14 to 1600 grit. This one, I calculate, comes out to be around 16 to 1800 grit. The wax one is a hard carnauba wax that you charge the buffing wheel on. So you turn this on at a relatively high speed, and that's all it takes to charge up the buffing wheel. I've been using the White Diamond almost exclusively because I think my sanding discs will give me about the 1200 grit to 1500 grit sanding, and this will give it that final polishing. Now, there are various kinds of different configurations you can use to get inside the bowls, and it depends on what you're buffing. There are some systems that have one of these wheels here, another one here, and another one there. And if you've got a real small piece, it's nice to have them all lined up because you can go from one to the other and to the finish wax, carnauba wax. However, it creates some difficulties when you've got a larger bowl because you can't get the bowl deep inside. And I'll show you how that works. This is one of my bark bowls, and I'll just demonstrate a bit here. Now you have to hold on both sides of this because this part of the wheel hitting here is going to catch the bowl and it will throw it away from you. So you would do the entire bowl with that. One of the problems with having the buffing wheels all side by side, you can't really get in around like that because you're either hitting the other buffing wheel or you're hitting the spindle in there. So having the single wheel on there helps you get around a lot better. That's how you can change either types of buffing wheels. This particular wheel comes with a mandrel here that you can put on a drill. This particular wheel comes with a threaded rod, and that fits in. And it just screws on into that. On this particular piece, I've got an extra spacer to bring it further away from the headstock. As I mentioned earlier, it's important that your finish is completely cured because there's a fair amount of heat that comes when you're putting the bowl against the buffing wheel. And if your finish isn't cured, it tends to soften this even more, and it starts piling up the finish. So it makes quite a mess, and you have to do a lot of sanding to get that off. So you would want a couple of days at least of curing the finish before you do the buffing on this kind of process. There's not as much heat built up on the buffing when the wheel is on a drill and you're using your lathe to run the bowl. Here's another process of buffing wheels. And it's got a threaded taper in here. And that threaded taper screws into the fibers in this particular buffing wheel. And then there's a Morris taper adapter you can put on that to go right inside. And again, you've got a threaded insert here, so you could put a threaded rod through your headstock. One of the advantages of these ball-like wheels is that you can get inside a bowl a lot easier and get that done. Using a system like this where the lathe is actually turning the buffing wheel and you're pushing the wood against it tends to give a little more aggressiveness to your buffing, and it gives a nicer finish. But again, you've got to wait for the finish to cure to do that, and you need to either reset up your particular lathe, or if you have a mini lathe, you can put it on and leave it there. And there's an expense to this process as well. Generally, I do not use a wax finish, nor do I use the wax buffing. My particular feeling on that is the wax gives a beautiful finish, a nice shine, and a nice feel. However, I think in a short time, you'll start leaving some fingerprints on the bowl, and I think the wax kind of dulls up and wears off after a while. So I just don't proceed in that direction. I stay at my homemade finish and leave it. This finish is not particularly new. There's a lot of companies that are putting out products like this. They're combining them all into one can and calling it the Sam Maloof finish or the Maloof finish. That's probably a good way to go. However, I'm not exactly sure what percentages they have in of tung oil, Varathane, and boiled linseed oil. I'm not sure if they have other ingredients in there. Another thing to be careful about is pure tung oil. This particular one was $50 Canadian. That's pretty expensive. but it's pure tung oil. You'll go to some of the big box stores and you'll see tung oil finish or any other kind of product with tung oil written on it. In some cases, there's only 5 or 10% tung oil in there. So I think you want to be careful. When I'm doing this, I know what my ingredients are and I know what's in each one of them. So doing it myself, I think, is a better way to go. The other issue that's important is the cost. There are some products out there that are as much as $150 for a gallon of finish. Some of them are fairly pricey. However, when you start combining $50 and $40 and $30 or $40 for the boiled linseed oil, that adds up as well. And these being about a liter each, you're not getting a full gallon, you're getting 3 liters in the end. So it does come out to be an expensive type of finish. But I think you can get all of those ingredients in small containers. And when you put the product in the stop-loss bags, you can keep them in those bags for quite a while. I've had some for over a year in a stop-loss bag and used it. It was still good. So those are some of my thoughts with regards to mixing your own finish. I really like the look that's produced with this kind of finish. It gives me a lot of control as well. I can put it into a very high gloss or into a satin finish. That's a preference for each wood turner. I hope you've enjoyed this brief video on finishing. I've had a lot of questions about how to do it and what I use. If you like this video, I would ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel to take a look at some of the other videos, ones like the one I made for this bowl. I'd like to hear your comments. Have you used this type of finish? Have you used the same Sam Maloof kind of recipe? Have you done things differently? What kind of finish do you like to use on your pieces? And is it working for you? So until the next time, keep on turning.
Grandpa Dennis is turning.
I'm alright, 'cause I'm okay. Doesn't matter if my beard is gray. Just listen, I have something to say.
Grandpa Dennis is turning.
I'm alright, 'cause I'm okay. And this old goat has something to say. So just keep learning, for Grandpa Dennis is turning.